Before she became the woman who made Hollywood's most glamorous actresses fight for her words, Liane Moriarty was just another suburban mum, scribbling dark thoughts between school pickups. But what if the twisted secrets in Big Little Lies weren't pure fiction? What if the most haunting drama she ever wrote was her own life? There's a strange tension that hangs over Moriarty's success, the kind of success built on stories that feel too real. Readers devour her books, sensing that behind every plot twist lies a truth someone's too afraid to say out loud. A cheating husband here, a buried trauma there, a mother who smiles too perfectly. The stories aren't just thrilling, they're eerily familiar, and Liane has never explained why. While millions around the world know her as the queen of psychological suburban thrillers, very few know the woman behind the pen. She rarely gives personal interviews, often dodging questions about her past with a disarming laugh. But if you pay attention, really pay attention, you'll notice something unsettling. The way she avoids eye contact when asked about motherhood. The silence that falls when people mention her family. The way her fictional women always seem to be on the brink of collapse. Was Liane simply born with a dark imagination? Or did something happen in her own quiet cul-de-sac that she can't talk about, but can't stop writing about? Today, we peel back the layers behind Australia's best-selling author, a woman who turned whispering neighbors and playground politics into global phenomena, but who may have hidden more in those pages than anyone realized. This is the untold story of Liane Moriarty, the woman whose own truths may be even more twisted than her fiction. Liane Moriarty emerged from the quiet northern suburbs of Sydney, a place of manicured lawns, competitive school mums, and barbecue Sundays that conceal more than they reveal. Born in 1966, she didn't explode onto the literary scene until much later in life. For years, she worked in advertising, crafting taglines and market strategies, all while quietly observing the peculiarities of middle-class Australian life. But behind her polished career and seemingly ordinary background, there was a growing discontent, a creative unrest. Something darker simmered under the surface. She wasn't from a celebrity family, but storytelling pulsed in her blood. Her mother had once tried and failed to get published. Her sister Jacqueline would go on to become a successful children's author. There was an invisible expectation around the Moriarty daughters. Write, succeed, do it gracefully. But behind those literary aspirations was a web of rivalry, pressure, and quiet comparison, none of which Liane ever addressed publicly. When she finally published her debut novel, 3 Wishes, at the age of 38, it didn't cause a storm. It was well received, but far from extraordinary. But it was her 3rd novel, The Husband's Secret, that became a cultural explosion. And then came Big Little Lies, the juggernaut, a novel that didn't just entertain, but unsettled. Women saw themselves in her characters, their resentment, their brokenness, their carefully curated facades. What most people didn't realize, however, was how closely these characters mirrored Liane's real life. The affluent school settings, the passive-aggressive mothers, the painful silences in marriage, these were all part of her world. Some even speculated that Big Little Lies was inspired by events at her own children's school. When asked, Liane would coyly smile and say, "Well, not exactly. But let's just say I didn't have to look far." There's something unspoken in her storytelling, an almost voyeuristic intimacy with emotional violence. The way she writes about gaslighting, emotional suppression, even domestic abuse, with such accuracy that survivors have written to her asking, "How did you know?" And that's where the intrigue begins. Liane has admitted that she doesn't outline her books in advance. "I start with a question," she says, "and I write to find the answer." But the questions she chooses: what if your husband confessed a crime on his deathbed? What if your child witnessed something too terrible to explain? What if your best friend's death wasn't an accident? Aren't just imaginative, they're deeply personal. By the time HBO adapted Big Little Lies, Liane was no longer just a writer, she was a phenomenon. But while Nicole Kidman and Reese Witherspoon brought her characters to life on screen, Liane herself faded further into the shadows. She rarely visited the set. She refused to move to Los Angeles. She didn't even watch the series as it aired, at least not publicly. When asked if she liked the show, she responded, "I think they did a beautiful job," and quickly changed the subject. This reluctance to stand in her own spotlight raised eyebrows. For someone who had written about women stepping into their truth, Liane remained stubbornly private. There were no tabloid scandals, no messy divorces, no tell-all memoirs. But in a way, that silence became its own mystery. Because what kind of woman writes the darkest corners of suburban life so vividly and then insists there's nothing to see? As we move deeper into Liane Moriarty's world, we begin to see the fractures beneath her controlled surface, the unspoken family tensions, the anxiety of fame, the blurred lines between fiction and confession, and above all, the looming question: has Liane been telling us her story all along, just in disguise? Liane Moriarty's early life gave little hint of the literary storm she would unleash. She grew up in a large, loving family, 6 children, modest home, the kind of warm chaos that breeds creativity. Her mother, who once dreamed of being a novelist, filled the house with books and encouragement. But while her siblings found their paths early, Liane seemed to drift. She worked in marketing, dabbled in freelance copywriting, and quietly stored away ideas that never quite turned into stories. It wasn't until her sister Jacqueline, already a published author, challenged her to try writing seriously that Liane finally enrolled in a master's degree in writing. For her thesis, she produced a manuscript that became her first novel, 3 Wishes. She was 38 years old. Unlike many debut authors, she wasn't chasing fame. In fact, she seemed almost reluctant about the literary world. But 3 Wishes was a quiet success, followed by The Last Anniversary, which caught more attention for its dry wit and subtle emotional depth. She built her reputation slowly, book by book, with stories that didn't scream but whispered and stayed with you. Then came The Husband's Secret, and everything changed. The book's premise, a woman who finds a letter from her husband, written only to be read after his death, confessing to a decades-old murder, was pure Moriarty. Ordinary people, extraordinary secrets. It became a New York Times bestseller, selling over 3 million copies worldwide. Oprah called it gripping. Reese Witherspoon snapped up the film rights. Liane was no longer a local Australian talent. She was an international sensation. And yet, her world didn't seem to change. She still lived in Sydney, still took her kids to school, still refused to court the media. She turned down most interviews and kept her family life fiercely protected. But beneath that normalcy, her writing took a darker turn. When Big Little Lies was released, critics noticed the shift. The novel wasn't just suspenseful, it was raw. It dealt with abuse, shame, guilt, and female rage in a way that felt dangerously close to real life. The characters, Madeline, Celeste, Jane, were women you might see at your local school's PTA meeting. And yet, they were drowning in secrets. Readers adored it. They said it felt like therapy. They cried at the final pages. But some quietly wondered, why did it all feel so real? What followed was an unexpected media blitz. HBO announced they would adapt Big Little Lies into a limited series. Nicole Kidman and Reese Witherspoon would star and produce. The world suddenly wanted to know everything about Liane Moriarty. But Liane didn't play the game. She gave carefully guarded interviews, always polite, always deflecting. She would joke that she wasn't glamorous enough for LA. But behind the charm was discomfort. Fame made her nervous. She once admitted in an interview, "I write about women like me, women I know. I think we all have secrets. We just don't want to say them out loud." It was a throwaway line. But to those who had been following her ascent, it sounded like something else. A confession wrapped in fiction. Then, just as her Hollywood momentum peaked, Liane made a strange decision. She said no to relocating, no to more appearances, and turned inward. She wrote 9 Perfect Strangers, a novel about a group of people attending a bizarre wellness retreat. It was darker, more surreal, and some critics found it uncomfortably personal. One reviewer noted, "It's as if she's finally writing about the cost of pretending everything's fine." Despite the growing fame, Liane never let the public get too close. She didn't appear on red carpets, didn't share family photos, didn't blog or tweet. She returned to being the quiet woman in the suburbs, even as her stories burned through the cultural consciousness. But cracks began to show. She was asked during a panel if any of her stories were inspired by real people. She paused, then laughed. "They might be, but I changed the names." That single sentence sparked endless speculation. Was the abusive husband in Big Little Lies based on someone she knew? Was the gossiping, vindictive school mom culture ripped from her own experience as a mother? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, was Liane Moriarty using fiction not just to tell stories, but to tell the truth that she couldn't say out loud? By the time Apples Never Fall came out, another dark tale of family dysfunction and buried secrets, the pattern had become clear. Liane Moriarty didn't just write psychological thrillers. She chronicled the untold traumas of modern womanhood. And perhaps in doing so, she was exercising something personal, something real, something she still refuses to name. The more Liane Moriarty insisted that her novels were fictional, the more readers began to doubt her, because the emotional truths she captured were too sharp, too specific. Her women were not archetypes, they were real. Their anguish, their helpless fury, their silent compromises, these were not imagined. They were lived. One of the most haunting examples lies in Big Little Lies. Celeste Wright, the elegant wife caught in an abusive marriage, was never written as a victim. She was intelligent, capable, beautiful, and yet trapped. Trapped not just by violence, but by shame. Readers were devastated by her arc. Some wrote to Liane, thanking her for telling their story. But one message in particular changed everything. It came from a woman in the suburbs of Sydney. She had read the book in a single night, sobbing. "You wrote about my marriage," she said. "You wrote about my silence. How did you know?" Liane never replied. But she kept the message. She mentioned it, quietly to a friend. And then never again. There were others too. Anonymous emails, confessions, even accusations. That she had betrayed a confidence, that she had described someone too precisely. That her books were not just fiction, but exposure. And the most whispered theory of all, that Celeste wasn't based on someone else. She was based on Liane. Liane has never confirmed or denied the rumor, but in one rare interview, when asked how she wrote scenes of emotional abuse with such clarity, she didn't answer. She simply stared for a moment, then said, "It's just what came to me. Sometimes, writing surprises you." There's more. Around the time 9 Perfect Strangers was released, gossip began to circle about a breakdown, a retreat, something unspoken. Liane had withdrawn from the media, missed events, canceled appearances. Her publicist offered vague explanations, creative fatigue, family time. But insiders whispered about something deeper, that the lines between her fiction and her reality had blurred too far. The novel itself read like a warning. 9 damaged people locked in a remote wellness resort, forced to confront the secrets they'd buried. The character Frances, an anxious, burned-out romance writer, was widely assumed to be a version of Liane herself. Frances cries over bad reviews, dreads aging, fantasizes about escape. It was the first time Liane had written someone so unfiltered, so exposed, and it scared people. Critics called the book a departure. Others called it a cry for help. Behind the scenes, those close to her reported tension. Her relationship with her sister Jacqueline, once celebrated as literary sisterhood, had cooled. The two no longer appeared at events together. Friends said the quiet competition had become uncomfortable. That Liane's rise had created shadows the family couldn't admit existed. And yet, Liane never lashed out, never gave interviews to defend herself. She simply wrote more. Apples Never Fall, her latest work, was about a matriarch who disappears, and the family who must reckon with her absence and her hidden truths. The book was brilliant and unsettling, because in it, Liane seemed to be asking, what happens when a woman vanishes? Emotionally, spiritually, even while still standing in the room? And maybe that was the point. Maybe Liane Moriarty never intended to become famous. Maybe all she wanted was to write through something she couldn't say aloud, to tell the stories she saw but couldn't name. The women who looked perfect but were breaking. The families who smiled for Christmas cards while falling apart inside. The mothers who gave everything and resented it quietly, deeply. Media loved the mystery. Journalists tried to probe her, to crack the surface. But Liane remained composed, and the more questions they asked, the more she disappeared behind her characters. In the end, the public didn't need a scandal to stay fascinated, because Liane Moriarty's real secret wasn't in what she said. It was in what she refused to say. And in every line she wrote, that silence echoed louder than any confession. As Big Little Lies became a cultural touchstone and Nine Perfect Strangers hit streaming platforms, one truth became undeniable. Liane hadn't just written stories. She had bled into them, quietly, elegantly, and possibly irreversibly. There's something profoundly unsettling and mesmerizing about Liane Moriarty. Not just because she writes gripping fiction, but because of how effortlessly she makes readers believe that what they're reading might actually be true. In an era where oversharing is currency and privacy is nearly extinct, Liane remains a riddle. A woman who rose to global fame not by broadcasting her life, but by hiding it inside her books. From the perspective of Aussie Uncovered, we see her not only as a masterful writer, but as a cultural mirror. Her novels tap into the emotional texture of Australian suburban life in a way no other writer has. She doesn't just describe the wine-soaked afternoons and school-run politics. She exposes what lurks behind them: the exhaustion, the fear, the guilt, the unspoken rage. But what makes her truly fascinating is how much of herself she doesn't show. This channel thrives on the tension between public image and private truth, and Liane Moriarty embodies that tension perfectly. She has built a brand on secrets while fiercely protecting her own. She writes about the collapse of facades while maintaining hers with precision. That duality is both haunting and admirable. Some may argue that we're reading too deeply into her fiction, that her stories are simply good storytelling, not veiled confessions. But the emotional resonance, the recurring themes, the raw vulnerability, they suggest otherwise. Again and again, her books return to women who are quietly unraveling behind smiles, who carry trauma no one sees. These aren't just characters. They feel like fragments of a deeper internal monologue, one the author herself refuses to speak aloud. And maybe that's why we respect her even more. In an age where many chase relevance by revealing too much, Liane Moriarty keeps us captivated by revealing just enough. She gives us glimpses, never answers. She invites speculation, never confirmation. And in doing so, she's built a mystique more enduring than any tabloid headline. As Australians, we often celebrate the loud, the bold, the sunburned success stories. But Liane is different. She's soft-spoken, almost invisible in the public eye, yet her words echo across continents. She writes about us, our streets, our families, our secrets. And perhaps that's why so many readers feel exposed when they finish her books, as if she's looked straight through them and whispered, "I know." What Aussie Uncovered sees in Liane Moriarty is not just a best-selling author. We see a chronicler of unspoken pain, a literary illusionist, a woman who never needed to sell her story because she wrote it into ours. But we want to hear from you. Do you think Liane's novels are reflections of her own life, or simply well-crafted fiction? Do you believe that a writer can separate themselves entirely from what they write, or is every novel in some way a confession? And if Liane Moriarty has been telling us something all along, between the lies, beneath the suspense, have we finally started to listen? Some writers build worlds. Liane Moriarty built mirrors. Each page she penned didn't transport us elsewhere. It brought us home. To quiet hallways and dinner tables, to the subtle cruelties passed between lovers, to the silent screams of women carrying too much. Her fiction didn't rescue us from reality. It unmasked it. And yet, for all the truths she unearthed, she never once declared her own. That's what makes her legacy so haunting. The questions linger, not just in her novels, but in the woman herself. What was Liane hiding when she wrote about women on the edge? What pain did she encode between lines of suburban calm and emotional carnage? We may never know. Perhaps she doesn't want us to. But maybe that's the point. Her books endure not because they solve mysteries, but because they leave new ones behind. And somewhere in Sydney tonight, there may be a woman walking her dog, returning to a quiet home, surrounded by silence that only she understands. Maybe she's writing again. Maybe she's remembering something she once promised herself to forget. Because not all stories end with a twist. Some end with a quiet truth left between the lines. A truth no interview will ever uncover. A truth only she and her pages will ever truly know. Some stories are never told. But now you know.